December 9th, 1902. The sun rises over the Caribbean Sea, painting the water gold and turquoise, peaceful as a tourist postcard. But beneath that deceptive calm, steel warships are converging on Venezuela's coastline. German gunboats steam in formation, their naval ensigns snapping in the tropical wind. British cruisers follow, guns loaded, sailors at battle stations. Italian destroyers join the armada. 3 European empires moving as one, bearing down on a single South American nation that made the mistake of not paying its bills. To anyone watching from shore, this looks like justice. A rogue dictator who refused to honor his debts. Civilized powers restoring order to a lawless regime. Gunboat diplomacy doing exactly what it's designed to do, forcing compliance through superior firepower. The world's newspapers reported as such. Venezuela's government had borrowed money, squandered it, and refused to repay. Now the creditors were coming to collect. Simple, straightforward, necessary. But there's something the newspapers don't know, something nobody saw coming. Because 90 miles to the east, in the waters off the island of Culebra near Puerto Rico, another fleet sits quietly at anchor. Admiral George Dewey, hero of Manila Bay, commander of the largest peacetime naval deployment in American history, sits aboard his flagship with 53 warships spread across the horizon. Every gun is loaded, every boiler is fired, every torpedo boat is ready to sail. And Admiral Dewey is waiting for one thing, a single telegraph message from President Theodore Roosevelt giving him permission to attack Germany. This isn't about debt collection. This is about empire. About whether European powers can still treat the Western Hemisphere as their colonial playground, or whether a rising United States will stop them by force. About who controls the Americas. About the future of an entire hemisphere. And about a moment that would reshape global power for the next century. What happened next has been carefully erased from most history books. The diplomatic crisis that nearly triggered a world war. The secret ultimatum that terrified a German Kaiser. The week when America drew a line in the Caribbean sand and dared Europe to cross it. And if you want to understand what's really happening in Venezuela right now, in 2026, why American warships are once again seizing Venezuelan oil tankers, why sanctions and blockades feel so familiar, you need to understand what happened 123 years ago in these same waters. Because the tragic irony is this. In 1902, America defended Venezuela against European aggression. In 2026, America has become precisely what it once fought against. His name was Cipriano Castro, and they called him the Lion of the Andes. In 1899, he crossed the Colombian border into Venezuela with exactly 60 soldiers. 60 men, not 600, not 6,000, 60. It sounds like a suicide mission, but 3 months later, Castro controlled the entire country. He marched his tiny army from victory to victory, toppling the previous government, crushing rival militias, and proclaiming himself president of Venezuela. It was an extraordinary military achievement, the kind of David versus Goliath story that makes for legends. American Secretary of State Elihu Root called him something else entirely. A crazy brute, probably the worst of Venezuela's many dictators. And Venezuela had endured plenty of dictators, so that was saying something. Castro inherited more than power. He inherited catastrophe. Venezuela owed foreign creditors 120 million bolivars in principal, plus another 46 million bolivars in accumulated interest. That's roughly $33 million in 1902 dollars. In today's money, adjusted for inflation, Venezuela owed nearly $1.2 billion. The problem? Venezuela's entire annual government revenue totaled just 30 million bolivars. The country was earning barely enough to pay the interest, let alone touch the principal. The debt came from decades of chaos. British banks had loaned millions for railway construction that civil wars destroyed before completion. German investors had poured capital into coffee plantations that revolutionaries burned to the ground. Italian merchants demanded compensation for property that previous governments had seized without payment. French companies wanted money for infrastructure projects that would never be built. Every regime before Castro had borrowed money to fight wars, suppress rebellions, or simply stay in power. And now Castro held the bill for decades of other people's corruption. But Castro looked at this impossible mountain of debt and made a calculation that seemed, at the time, almost rational. He simply refused to pay, not delayed payment, not renegotiation. Complete, absolute refusal. To understand why Castro thought he could get away with this, we must examine the economic forces at work and the geopolitical assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong. Castro's logic was straightforward. Europe wouldn't dare invade Venezuela, not because Venezuela was militarily strong, but because America was politically powerful. In 1823, President James Monroe had issued a doctrine declaring the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European colonization. For nearly 80 years, this Monroe Doctrine had served as a protective shield for Latin American nations. Whenever European powers threatened intervention, the United States invoked Monroe's declaration. Castro assumed, like many Latin American leaders before him, that Uncle Sam would protect him. He was about to learn a painful lesson about the difference between colonization and debt collection. For most of 1902, Britain and Germany tried diplomacy. They genuinely did. The British Foreign Office sent Venezuela 17 formal diplomatic notes between January and June. 17 separate communications demanding payment, requesting negotiation, proposing arbitration, pleading for some acknowledgement that Venezuela intended to honor its obligations. Castro's response to all 17? Complete silence. He didn't even bother replying. Germany tried a different approach. Berlin proposed international arbitration at the newly established Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. A neutral judge, binding legal decision, peaceful resolution through international law. Castro ignored them entirely. To Castro, these European complaints were noise, empty threats from distant empires that lacked the courage to act. Then, in June 1902, Venezuelan military forces seized a British merchant vessel off the coast, claiming it was smuggling weapons to rebel groups. Whether the accusation was true didn't matter. Seizing a British ship was the last straw. Britain's Foreign Office sent an encrypted cable to Berlin with a simple message: "We're done negotiating." Germany agreed immediately. Italy, eager to protect its own investors and assert itself as a rising power, enthusiastically joined the alliance. By August 1902, the three European powers had finalized their strategy: naval blockade, asset seizure, and, if necessary, military bombardment of Venezuelan ports. But they needed American approval. Not legal permission exactly, but political cover. Because everyone remembered 1895, when Britain tried to pressure Venezuela over a border dispute with British Guiana, and President Grover Cleveland nearly took America to war to stop them. The crisis had pushed the United States and Britain to the brink of armed conflict. So in late 1901, German Ambassador Theodor von Holleben approached President Theodore Roosevelt with a carefully worded question. If we promise not to seize Venezuelan territory permanently, only to collect legitimate debts owed to our citizens, would the United States object under the Monroe Doctrine? Roosevelt's answer shocked von Holleben. "I do not intend to raise any objection," Roosevelt declared, "so long as there is no acquisition of territory." The Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt explained, prohibited European colonization and permanent territorial seizure. Temporary debt collection? That was Europe's legal right. Roosevelt even added, with biting sarcasm, that he was sure Kaiser Wilhelm felt the same way about Germany's temporary 99-year lease of Kiao Chau Bay in China. The German Kaiser was delighted. Britain was relieved. Italy was enthusiastic. And Castro, reading intelligence reports of these diplomatic exchanges in Caracas, still believed America would save him at the last moment. He was catastrophically, disastrously wrong. On December 7, 1902, Germany and Britain issued simultaneous ultimatums to Venezuela. Pay your debts immediately, in full, or face military consequences. Castro, absolutely convinced this was an empty bluff, didn't even bother to respond. On December 9th, the blockade began. German warships SMS Panther, Falk, Gazelle, and Veneta arrived off Venezuela's coast and seized control of the nation's major ports. British cruisers intercepted and captured Venezuela's entire navy, 4 pathetically decrepit vessels so unseaworthy that the Germans sank 2 of them rather than waste effort towing them away. Venezuelan customs houses, the only significant source of government revenue, were occupied by foreign marines. European naval forces began boarding every merchant ship attempting to enter or leave Venezuelan waters, strangling the country's trade. But there was a problem. Blockade wasn't enough. On December 13, 1902, German and British warships opened fire on the coastal fortifications at Puerto Cabello, Venezuela's principal port. The bombardment lasted for hours. Shore batteries returned fire, but were hopelessly outgunned. Buildings collapsed under naval shell fire. Fires spread through the waterfront. Venezuelan soldiers abandoned their positions and fled inland. In retaliation, Castro's government arrested approximately 200 British and German residents living in Venezuela, throwing them into military prisons. And suddenly, what had begun as debt collection looked disturbingly like imperial invasion. Theodore Roosevelt sat in the Oval Office reading intelligence reports from the Caribbean, and his blood pressure was rising with every page. This was not what he had agreed to. Not at all. Bombardment was not debt collection. Seizing ports was not arbitration. Arresting civilians was not financial negotiation. And most troubling of all, American intelligence was receiving disturbing reports that Germany was considering something far more permanent than a temporary blockade, a naval coaling station, a military base. Perhaps even a permanent colony, Monroe Doctrine be damned. Roosevelt had a particular obsession, and that obsession was the future Panama Canal. For years, Roosevelt had dreamed of an American-controlled canal cutting through Central America, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It would be the greatest engineering achievement of the age, a technological marvel that would revolutionize global trade and cement American naval dominance. Roosevelt was willing to do almost anything to make that canal happen. He would later orchestrate a revolution in Colombia to create the independent nation of Panama, specifically to secure canal rights. And here was Germany, establishing what looked increasingly like a permanent military presence just a few hundred miles from where Roosevelt planned to build his canal. A German naval base in Venezuela would give the Kaiser's fleet easy access to the Caribbean, the ability to threaten American shipping, and a forward position to interfere with the Panama Canal. It was strategically unacceptable. But Roosevelt faced a delicate political problem. He couldn't simply reverse his earlier public statement without looking weak and indecisive. He'd already told Germany that the blockade was acceptable under international law. Publicly changing his mind now would humiliate American diplomacy and make Roosevelt look foolish. Foreign leaders would question whether American commitments meant anything. So instead of public declarations and diplomatic notes, Roosevelt chose private menace. He summoned Admiral George Dewey to the White House. Dewey was perfect for this particular mission. He was a genuine American hero, the man who in 1898 had sailed into Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War and destroyed the entire Spanish Pacific Fleet without losing a single American sailor. Dewey had a well-deserved reputation for coolness under fire, tactical brilliance, and a personal dislike of German naval officers stemming from an incident in Manila where a German admiral had challenged his authority. Roosevelt's instructions to Dewey were chilling in their simplicity. Assemble the largest fleet ever gathered in American waters. Position them in the Caribbean within striking distance of Venezuela, and be ready to sail at 1 hour's notice. This wasn't a training exercise. This was a direct military threat. Within 2 weeks, 53 American warships converged on the island of Culebra, just off the coast of Puerto Rico. Every available battleship, armored cruiser, torpedo boat, destroyer, and auxiliary vessel in the Atlantic Fleet steamed to the Caribbean. It was the largest concentration of American naval power in peacetime history. Sailors watched in awe as the fleet assembled, ship after ship, arriving until the anchorage looked like a floating city of steel. Dewey didn't just assemble the fleet. He prepared for war. He requested detailed supply inventories for all contingencies. A naval euphemism that everyone understood meant extended combat operations. Ammunition was loaded. Coal bunkers were filled to capacity. Medical supplies were stockpiled. Reconnaissance patrols were dispatched to chart Venezuelan waters. Instead of announcing this mobilization publicly, Roosevelt kept it quiet. No press releases, no public statements, just 53 warships appearing silently in the Caribbean like ghosts. But intelligence services don't miss 53 warships. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II received urgent reports from his naval attachés. The Americans had assembled a massive fleet. Admiral Dewey was in command. The ships were positioned for immediate combat. And the German ambassador was reporting that Roosevelt's mood had shifted from tolerance to barely controlled fury. The Kaiser began to understand he had made a terrible miscalculation. Nobody knows exactly what Theodore Roosevelt said to German Ambassador Theodor von Holleben in their private meeting. There is no written record, no official transcript, no secretary's notes, no diplomatic memorandum. That was entirely deliberate. Roosevelt understood the value of plausible deniability. If negotiations failed and war erupted, both sides could claim the other was responsible. If negotiations succeeded, both sides could save face. But we know what happened immediately after that meeting, and that tells us everything we need to know. Sometime in early December 1902, probably December 11th or 12th, Roosevelt invited Ambassador von Holleben to the White House. The meeting was not on the official presidential schedule. No reporters were informed. No other diplomats were present. It was just the President of the United States and the Ambassador of Imperial Germany, alone in a room. Roosevelt was characteristically blunt. Germany had 10 days to accept international arbitration and begin withdrawing its fleet from Venezuelan waters, or the United States would intervene militarily. Not diplomatic intervention, not economic pressure, military intervention. War. Dewey's fleet was supplied, armed, positioned, and ready to sail. The ultimatum was genuine, and the deadline was absolute. Von Holleben, a career diplomat accustomed to the careful language of international negotiations, tried to bargain for more time. He explained that consulting Berlin would take days, that the Kaiser would need time to consider, that such a momentous decision couldn't be rushed. Roosevelt cut him off mid-sentence. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a final warning. Von Holleben requested a 2-week extension to properly consult with his government. Roosevelt's response was withering. In that case, I must advance my ultimatum by 24 hours. The deadline wasn't extending. It was shrinking. Every attempt to delay would make the situation worse. The ambassador left the White House in what witnesses described as a state-approaching panic. That night, December 14, 1902, von Holleben sent the most urgent communication of his entire diplomatic career to Berlin. The message was clear. Roosevelt was not bluffing. American intelligence had revealed that Dewey's fleet was ready to attack. If Germany refused arbitration, war with the United States would begin within days, possibly within hours. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II and his military advisors faced an impossible choice. German national honor demanded resistance. The German Empire could not be seen publicly backing down to American threats. If Germany surrendered to Roosevelt's ultimatum, every other power would view Germany as weak, as an empire that made bold proclamations but folded under pressure. But German military strategy demanded caution. Germany's powerful battle fleet was concentrated in European waters, thousands of miles away from the Caribbean. Moving significant naval forces across the Atlantic would take weeks. Meanwhile, America's fleet was already in position, fully supplied, commanded by an aggressive admiral and operating in waters close to American bases. Any naval engagement would happen on America's terms, in America's territory, with American ships fresh and German ships exhausted from a transatlantic journey. And Britain, Germany's supposed ally in this Venezuelan adventure, was quietly backing away from the conflict. The British government, reading increasingly hostile public opinion in London's newspapers, realized the Venezuelan debt collection operation was wildly unpopular with British citizens. British papers were calling it gunboat thuggery and questioning why Britain was helping Germany intimidate a small nation. If Germany provoked an actual war with the United States, Britain would not support them. Germany would face the American fleet alone. The Kaiser made his decision. On December 17, 1902, less than 24 hours after Roosevelt's final shortened deadline, Ambassador von Holleben appeared once again at the White House. His face was, according to one eyewitness account, wreathed in smiles. On behalf of His Imperial Majesty Kaiser Wilhelm II, the ambassador had the great honor to formally request that President Theodore Roosevelt serve as neutral arbitrator in Germany's dispute with Venezuela. Roosevelt graciously accepted. He then publicly praised the Kaiser's admirable commitment to peaceful resolution and respect for international law. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic celebrated the diplomatic triumph. The crisis was over. The blockade would be lifted. Arbitration would proceed. But the world had fundamentally, permanently changed. The immediate settlement seemed technical, almost boring. In February 1903, after 2 months of negotiations, the Washington Protocols were formally signed. Venezuela agreed to repay its debts using 30% of customs revenues from its 2 largest ports, La Guaira and Puerto Cabello. Each creditor nation initially received $2,500 in immediate payment, equivalent to roughly $962,000 in today's dollars. Germany was promised an additional $340,000 within 3 months, approximately $11.9 million in current value. The total claims were reduced by 150 million bolivars through negotiation, and a long-term payment schedule was established based on Venezuela's actual revenue capacity. Venezuela would spend the next several decades making those payments. The European powers got most of their money back, though much less than they'd originally demanded. Castro remained in power, at least temporarily. On the surface, it looked like a standard debt settlement. But the real settlement wasn't about money at all. It was about power. Theodore Roosevelt had demonstrated that the United States would use overwhelming military force to prevent European intervention in the Western Hemisphere. Not just territorial seizure or permanent colonization. Any intervention that America deemed threatening to its interests. Roosevelt had taken the 80-year-old Monroe Doctrine, which had always been more principle than policy, and backed it with 53 warships and a credible threat of war. Europe had blinked, America had won, and the balance of global power shifted. 2 years later, in 1905, Roosevelt formalized this new policy in what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. In a message to Congress, Roosevelt declared that the United States had the right to exercise international police power throughout Latin America to prevent chronic wrongdoing or impotence that might invite European intervention. Read that carefully. Read it twice. America wasn't just excluding European powers from the Western Hemisphere. America was claiming the explicit right to intervene itself, to occupy, to control finances, to overthrow governments, to police the entire hemisphere, all in the name of keeping Europeans out. And that's exactly what happened. U.S. Marines landed in the Dominican Republic in 1904 to take over customs collection. They occupied Nicaragua from 1912 to 1933 to protect American business interests. They invaded Haiti in 1915 and didn't leave until 1934. American banks systematically replaced European banks as Latin America's primary creditors. American corporations replaced European companies as Latin America's economic exploiters. The United Fruit Company, Standard Oil, and other American giants extracted resources while local populations remained impoverished. Latin Americans gave this new system a bitter nickname, the Colossus of the North. They watched as the United States became precisely what it had supposedly protected them against. European imperialism was replaced with American hegemony. The method changed. The result was the same. 3 days ago, on January 11, 2026, American naval forces seized a Venezuelan oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. President Donald Trump announced the capture publicly, calling it the largest tanker ever seized in American history. Venezuela's government condemned it as piracy. Russia demanded an explanation. China issued warnings. And suddenly, the Caribbean once again feels like the most dangerous body of water on Earth. The details have changed, but the pattern is identical. In 1902, the issue was unpaid debts and European blockades. In 2026, it's economic sanctions and asset seizures. In 1902, the perceived threat was German colonialism. In 2026, it's Russian military cooperation and Chinese economic investment. But the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Foreign powers circling Venezuela and America responding with force. To understand what's really happening right now, you need to understand what happened 123 years ago. In 1902, America stopped European empires from exploiting Venezuela. On the surface, it was a noble act. Protection of the weak against the strong. Defense of the Western Hemisphere against foreign aggression. Roosevelt was celebrated as a hero who had prevented Venezuela from becoming a European colony. But America didn't save Venezuela for Venezuela's sake. America saved Venezuela to control Venezuela. The Roosevelt corollary made that absolutely explicit. America would exclude European power so that American power could dominate without competition. Protection and control are often the same thing. The protector becomes the exploiter. The liberator becomes the occupier. The defender becomes the threat. This is not a conspiracy theory or anti-American propaganda. This is documented historical pattern, repeated across more than a century. Venezuela learned this lesson in 1902. The rest of Latin America learned it over the following decades through occupations, coups, and interventions. And if we're paying attention, if we're willing to see patterns rather than isolated incidents, we're watching the exact same dynamic unfold right now in 2026, in real time, in the same Caribbean waters where Admiral Dewey's fleet once threatened war against Germany. History doesn't repeat itself exactly. The ships are different, the technology has changed, the legal justifications are updated. But history absolutely, undeniably rhymes. And the rhyme scheme of American intervention in Venezuela has remained remarkably consistent for 123 years and counting. The warships in the Caribbean, the justifications of protecting freedom and democracy, the reality of protecting economic and strategic interests. It's the same song, verse after verse, decade after decade, century after century. And until we recognize the pattern, until we're willing to name it clearly, it will continue playing long into the future.